In 1914, a conflict erupted in Europe. Over hundreds of years, a convoluted network of alliances had formed between its many nations. Individual rivalries between the larger states were kept civil, but a deep grudge between the Balkan countries came to a head when the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated by a Serbian terrorist group. Like that, the powder keg blew, and the First World War was underway. The United States wouldn't enter the war until 1917, but its effects would linger in the lives of its veterans long after returning home. Readjustment was difficult, and countless young men were left with neither hope nor future. The Bonus Act was passed in 1924, guaranteeing a government paycheck for veterans based on days served. Many of these bonuses went unpaid for almost a decade, and in 1932, the fighters of the greatest war the world had ever seen, in the clutches of the greatest depression the world had ever seen, once again marched, not for their country on foreign soil, but for their lives on the state capitol.
I came to Washington to get my bonus, and I'm going to wait for it till I get it if I have to wait till 1945.
What that brought you to Washington?
Well, to beat the Undertaker, spend the money before the Undertaker gets it.
Makes me so damn mad a whole lot of people speak of you as tramps. By God, they didn't speak of you as tramps in 1917 and 18. No.
The bonus marchers, 20,000 in number, would be repelled by the U.S. Army. They would not receive their payouts. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese bombers representing the Axis powers bombed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In 5 days, the United States declared its entry into what was now the Second World War. This time, President Roosevelt refused to let veterans out in the cold. The GI Bill was signed into law in June of 1944, providing benefits to all service men and women, including unemployment, job counseling, loans, and paid education. In 1947, 49% of college admissions were veterans. The military saw a surge in recruitment. In 1939, enrollment totaled just over 300,000. By the end of the war, that number had ballooned to over 12 million. Higher education was now available to more people in America than ever before, and the infrastructure was struggling to keep up. It may have been a good problem to have, but it was still a problem, and it needed to be solved. The launch of the Russian Sputnik 1 satellite in 1957 spurred a new interest in technology for U.S. leaders. A year later, they would already be discussing the possibility of computer instruction. In 1959, scientists and mathematicians at the University of Illinois began tossing around the idea of just such a system. After failing to develop anything worthwhile, physicist Daniel Alpert mentioned the project to an assistant named Donald Bitzer. Bitzer became the father of PLATO, programmed logic for automatic teaching operations, and PLATO would birth the future of computing.
The implications are staggering.
PLATO is a highly interactive, graphic-based, individualized, computer-based education system.
We could develop interactive classrooms right in their community or locale, 50 or 100 miles or ever so many miles away from the campus. And they can have one-way video, two-way audio, two-way data communication with PLATO terminals, and have a live interactive classroom with a teacher taught from our campus but sitting in their own locale. That's the future.
Over the next decade, the system would see 3 major revisions, each one introducing a range of features you probably find hard to believe. It started small with a basic display on a television and an early version of a keyboard. Then there was support for 2 users at once to access a limited number of instructional programs. The PLATO 3 allowed any user to write software for it in the Tutor programming language. At this point, up to 20 PLATO terminals could connect at once, remotely. After extensive funding from the US military, the system finally came into full form in 1972 with PLATO 4, the first true multimedia machine. Color display on a plasma screen that could draw simple vectors and characters. a hard drive specifically for sound effects, including voice synthesis and music via the Gooch synthetic woodwind, the first touch display. With the PLATO 4 came the dawn of what historian Brian Deere calls cyberculture. Networks of terminals could host scores of users at the same time in a way that is shockingly similar to the modern internet. To show you what I mean, I think it's better to, well, show you. pterm is an emulator that recreates the front end of a PLATO terminal. In order to get past the starting screen, you need a Cyber1 sign-on. Cyber1 is a modern-day mainframe system operated by the good people at cyber1.org. It's technically the server that you are accessing to use PLATO through pterm. Getting a sign-on is a little more old school than just autofilling some information into a registration form. You have to wait for your request to be processed by the team at Cyber1 and confirm in an email that you've logged on successfully. Now you log onto your account and are told to just type something in. The various programs written for PLATO are known as courseware and are sometimes referred to as lessons or something similar. Big Jump takes you to a directory of available courseware, ranging from simple educational games to the foundations of entire genres. Dungeons & Dragons was released in 1974 and quickly gained a cult following, including the likes of Rusty Rutherford, who developed Petit 5. The first roguelike game featuring RPG elements, dungeon crawling, and permadeath. Petit 5 was deleted at one point. The only reason it's called 5 is that it was an open program slot meant for the U of I's Population and Energy group. Administrators thought it was an inappropriate use of resources. What you're seeing now is Orthanc, a recreation later uploaded to the PLATO network. It's pretty fascinating to see the commonalities in these early computer games, where titles like Tennis for Two and Space War were based on existing games or simple concepts. Many of these take direct inspiration from Dungeons & Dragons. There's literally a game called D&D. Petit 5, Avatar, Camelot, Orthanc, D&D, and more that I probably missed, all aimed to recreate the spirit of adventuring through a dungeon, with the long-term goal being to beat your previous record. Some of these do push the envelope in interesting ways. Future War caught my eye for opening with an original poem that sounds like the round start in an Arxis game.
If you can't obey the law, don't go me.
Monstrosity. Monstrosity of a monster's death wish, wearing hell's halo and hovering high above a ruined planet's deathbed scene. Mushroom cloud like a monstrous jellyfish, soaring like a damned angel in the sky. Too late to contemplate what could have been, but not too late to mourn what we have lost. Our lives were lies we could not bear the cost of being our own gods, and holding in these trembling hands the scales of grace and sin. We dropped them and they clattered from our hands. They shattered and I hope God understands. And who am I, you ask me, who am I? Just someone who is too alive to die.
The wheel of fate is turning. Rebel 1, action!
Oh, that really hurts my throat. Future War shows off a first-person view, which some of these other games also emulated. You would have to remember that at this time, video games weren't a thing. Conventions that are standard now just didn't exist. These early attempts at different perspectives and styles weren't based on anything but the creator's interests and imagination. Space Sim was the original virtual flight simulator, making use of the PLATO's wireframe graphics to display simple shapes. It, along with Empire, were multiplayer games focusing on strategy and combat between networks of up to 32 simultaneous players. Both games took inspiration from Star Trek, outright naming factions after Romulans and the Federation. There's no one to play online when I was visiting, so I can't describe the gameplay with any first-hand knowledge, but I did dig up this little tidbit. The position of each ship was updated only when its player updated his screen, which permitted ships to discontinuously hop or hyperjump. Conversely, torpedo locations updated whenever any player in the game updated their screen. so their movements were effectively continuous. This simple game mechanic, forced upon the designers by the limitations of the terminal and the central computer, paradoxically gave Empire a great deal of tactical depth by making it a limited information game. For example, a player, seeing torps launched towards him, could wait without replotting until they were about to be hit, then change course towards the attacker, go to maximum speed, and hyperjump over the torps, then fire his own torps. Since the players could only have a limited number of torps active at any time, the original attacker would have to detonate his torps and launch new ones in order to respond. Of course, an experienced player, knowing that this was likely to happen, would likely have already detonated his first cluster of torps and launched a new set, hoping that his opponent would hyperjump right into them, except that the opponent, knowing this, would do something slightly different. The best players could get inside the heads of other players, figure out what they were going to do, influence them to do certain things, and destroy them. I had to laugh the first time I read that because it describes evolving strategies in an identical way to the most enduring competitive games and genres. This is nearly 50-year-old tech. I can imagine StarCraft-style announcers describing a player's use of hyperjumps in tournament. Empire was adapted with permission into Galactic Attack by Robert Woodhead, and the sales of that game would fund his next title, Wizardry, in 1980. Wizardry is a primary influence on RPGs worldwide, with its DNA in everything from Dragon Quest to the Elder Scrolls. It's strange to think that our current understanding of a whole genre might be wildly different if it weren't for the PLATO. Even still, the most important contribution PLATO made was embedded into its very core as a mainframe network. The PLATO was about community. As it was an academic tool and an ongoing project, the PLATO was designed with a system where users could leave notes to report bugs. This was simple enough, but there were problems. For one thing, only one person could edit the file at a time. For another, there was no security at all. It was impossible to know for sure who had written a note. Most people signed or at least initialed their comments, but there was nothing to enforce this, and occasionally some joker would think it was fun to delete the entire file. They developed a solution. When a user left a note, it would be stamped with their ID and the time they left it. Some issues may require a dialogue with other staff, so these posts would support up to 63 replies. Eventually, users asked that there be some organization for notes based on different topics. It was impossible to pin down what topics there should be and how many, so group notes were developed. Users could create private notes and share access to them with others, making them the hosts who decided what the topic was. Later that same year, 1973, another programmer named Doug Brown would release the Talkomatic, a chat program that showed messages as they were being typed in real time. It was an open forum with no direct messaging, which David Woolley describes as a virtual water cooler. Naturally, the Talkomatic evolved into a dedicated chat feature called Term Talk, and soon after, personal notes would be introduced as an early email system. PLATO users would meet over these channels, form relationships, friendships, romances. They'd play games with others or use it as a platform to share their entertaining thoughts. They got into arguments and pulled pranks under the shroud of anonymity. The PLATO mainframe was manufactured by Control Data Corporation, and by the 1980s, they saw potential for it as a commercial product. William Norris, president of CDC, began running ads, pitching it as an alternative to traditional education. The micro-PLATO was a mass-market push into the fresh home computer market. Doug Bitzer would reflect on his creation's eventual commercial failure. He pointed to the system's high cost, which was necessary to offset development of courseware. Ironically, on the system for which so many groundbreaking programs were coded for free, courseware cost $300,000 per delivery hour to produce. Norris left his CEO position at CDC, and the PLATO would dwindle away. For his part, he blamed CDC misunderstanding the real value of the system. The micro-PLATO was released without any networking functions. While they focused on its ability to teach, they forgot about its ability to connect. While researching the PLATO, I kept saying to myself, no way, really? And this is so cool. So much of our daily lives can be traced back to this network in Illinois, the predecessors to email, forums, boards, subreddits, messengers, hashtags, posting stupid memes and silly fiction, staying up late with friends and playing games, getting lost in new worlds. It all started here, with a clock and a sign-on. Hey, if you're still interested in the history of the PLATO, I'd recommend The Friendly Orange Glow by Brian Deere. It's an exhaustive history of the system and goes into much, much more detail than I was able to here. Leave a comment and tell me what you think, as well as any suggestions for future videos. Bye!